Imagine you have been at sea for 90 days. No solid ground beneath your feet. No fresh food. No quiet. Just the constant roar of engines, the smell of salt and diesel, and the company of a few hundred other men packed into steel corridors so tight you can barely breathe. And then, one morning, someone shouts those two words that every sailor lives for. Liberty Call. The gangway drops. The city opens up. And for the next 24, 48, maybe 72 hours, you are free. That moment, that single breath of freedom after weeks or months at sea, has defined the soul of the American Navy since the very beginning. But what sailors did with that freedom, where they went, what they drank, who they loved, what they lost, and what they carried home, that story has never fully been told. Not the cleaned-up version. Not the sanitized textbook version. The real story. The human story. Welcome. Today we are going deep into Port Liberty culture. We are talking about how American sailors spent their shore leave from the fires of World War II all the way through the modern Navy of today. We are going to walk the streets of Pearl Harbor and San Diego. We are going to sit in the bars of Yokosuka and Naples. We are going to feel the electricity of Times Square in 1945 and the neon glow of Subic Bay in 1975. And we are going to understand something that military historians rarely talk about openly. That shore leave was not just rest and recreation. It was survival. It was identity. It was the beating human heart inside the iron machine of the United States Navy. So buckle in. This is going to be a long one. And every single minute of it is worth your time. Let us start at the very beginning of our journey. World War II. The year is 1941. The world has just been shattered. Pearl Harbor has been bombed. Thousands of young American men, many of them barely out of high school, have suddenly found themselves in Navy uniforms, shipped off to training camps in Virginia and California and Illinois, and then loaded onto ships headed toward waters they had never imagined seeing. The average sailor in World War II was 20 years old. He came from a small town in Ohio or a tenement apartment in Brooklyn or a farm in Georgia. He had never been more than 100 miles from home. And suddenly he was on a destroyer in the Pacific Ocean, or a cruiser in the Atlantic, running convoy routes through waters patrolled by German U-boats. Shore leave in the early years of the war was both precious and chaotic. When a ship pulled into a friendly port, whether that was Honolulu, San Francisco, Brisbane, or later the newly liberated ports of Europe, the men came off those gangways with a hunger that went beyond physical need. They were hungry for normalcy. For the feeling of solid ground. For the sound of music and laughter that did not involve a battle station alarm. Honolulu became the most famous liberty port of the entire Pacific War. Before December 7, 1941, Honolulu had been a sleepy, beautiful island city with a modest tourist trade and a small but lively nightlife district centered around Hotel Street. After Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Overnight, Hawaii became the staging ground for the entire Pacific Campaign, and Honolulu became flooded with hundreds of thousands of military personnel cycling through on their way to and from combat zones. Hotel Street was the epicenter of it all. This was not a glamorous place. It was raw and real and loud and alive. The street was lined with bars, pool halls, tattoo parlors, photograph studios, and restaurants. The smells of frying food and cigarette smoke and cheap cologne hung in the humid Hawaiian air. Sailors would line up 3 and 4 deep at bars, drinking whatever was available, which during the war rationing years was often watered-down beer or rough local spirits. The USO was there too, of course. The United Service Organizations had set up clubs and canteens throughout Honolulu where sailors could get a hot meal, play pool, write letters home, and sometimes dance with volunteer hostesses who had signed up to provide wholesome entertainment for the troops. The USO clubs were enormously popular, and the organization deserves enormous credit for understanding something fundamental about human psychology. Men who are treated with dignity and given access to simple human warmth perform better, fight better, and endure more. The USO understood that. But Hotel Street also had its darker side. Prostitution was not just tolerated in wartime Honolulu. It was, for much of the early war, openly regulated. There were established houses operating under a system of military supervision, with health inspections and price controls and waiting lines that stretched around the block. This is a part of history that does not appear in most official accounts, but it is real, and it shaped the experience of thousands of American sailors during those years. The photograph studios on Hotel Street did remarkable business. Sailors would pay to have their portrait taken in full uniform, and then they would mail the photograph home to their mothers and sweethearts and fathers. Many of these photographs survive today in family albums and museum archives, and when you look at those faces, those young faces staring into the camera with a mixture of bravado and vulnerability, you feel the weight of that moment. These boys were trying to say something that words could not carry. They were saying, "I am here. I am alive. Remember me." Music was everywhere during the World War II shore leave experience. Big band swing was the soundtrack of that generation. Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman. You could hear the music pouring out of every bar and canteen on Hotel Street. Sailors would dance with local women and USO hostesses, doing the Lindy Hop and the Jitterbug on improvised dance floors, and for those few hours the war would recede just far enough to let them breathe. On the mainland, the story was similar but different in its own ways. San Francisco was the great Pacific port of the American West Coast, and during the war it was electrified with military energy. Sailors on Liberty in San Francisco had the run of the city. The cable cars, the restaurants of Chinatown and North Beach, the jazz clubs of the Fillmore District. The city embraced its servicemen with genuine warmth and also with a healthy commercial appetite, because sailors on Liberty spend money, and merchants knew it. The bars along the Embarcadero and in the Tenderloin District were legendary for their noise and their chaos and their sense of barely contained wildness. Fights happened. Shore Patrol, the Navy's own military police force, was a constant presence, walking the streets in pairs with their white hats and their brassard armbands, breaking up brawls and herding drunk sailors back to their ships before their liberty expired. Getting caught returning late from Liberty was a serious matter. Missing ship's movement, meaning being absent when your vessel left port, was among the most serious offenses a sailor could commit. Men who missed their ships faced courts-martial and potential prison sentences. The Shore Patrol existed partly to prevent this from happening, rounding up Liberty hounds who had lost track of time or simply did not want to go back. There was something almost mythological about the Shore Patrol in the culture of enlisted sailors. They were simultaneously resented and respected. Nobody liked being grabbed by the SP when they were in the middle of a good time. But every sailor also understood, on some level, that the Shore Patrol was what stood between individual freedom and total organizational collapse. Without them, ships would leave port half-crewed and the whole operation falls apart. New York City held its own special place in the mythology of World War II shore leave. Times Square in 1943, 1944, 1945 was unlike anything that exists in the world today. It was simultaneously the crossroads of the world and the front parlor of a nation at war. Sailors poured off troop trains at Penn Station and Grand Central and made straight for Times Square, where the restaurants and theaters and bars were running full speed around the clock. The Stage Door Canteen on West 44th Street was one of the most famous entertainment venues in America during the war. It was a USO-affiliated club where Hollywood stars, Broadway performers, and musicians came to entertain servicemen for free. A sailor could walk in off the street and find himself dancing with a famous actress or having his hand shaken by a movie star. The canteen operated on the principle that the men fighting for America deserved to be treated like royalty, even for one night. But Times Square was also where you could find every kind of trouble you were looking for if that was what you were after. The areas around 42nd Street and 8th Avenue were rough and colorful and full of temptation. Pickpockets worked the crowds. Gamblers ran shell games on the sidewalk. Bars sold watered drinks at inflated prices to sailors who did not know any better or did not care. And yet, overwhelmingly, what sailors in New York wanted was simple human contact. They wanted to sit in a diner and eat a real meal. They wanted to call home from a pay phone and hear their mother's voice. They wanted to go to a movie and sit in the dark and watch something that had nothing to do with ships or submarines or kamikaze planes. They wanted, for a few hours, to be ordinary young men in a big city, not instruments of war. The letters that sailors wrote home from Liberty ports during World War II are some of the most moving documents in American history. They are full of details. The food they ate. The beer they drank. The weather. The people they met. What they saw from the window of a cab or a bus. What the city smelled like. What the music sounded like in the bar on the corner. These letters were deliberate acts of memory-making, attempts to preserve the experience of being alive in the present moment, because every sailor knew that the present moment was not guaranteed. Now let us move forward in time. The war ends. August 1945. The atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrenders. And all across the Pacific, in ports from Manila to Pearl Harbor to the newly occupied harbors of Japan itself, American sailors experience a shore leave unlike any other in history. The war is over. The whole world is exhaling at once. The famous photograph taken by Alfred Eisenstadt in Times Square on August 14, 1945, the one showing a sailor kissing a nurse in white, captures something real about that moment, even if the details of who those people were have been disputed for decades. That image, whatever its exact story, is a portrait of relief so total and so physical that it had to find a physical expression. The war was over. The killing was over. The dying was over. And people grabbed the nearest person and held on. The immediate post-war period created a fascinating transitional moment in shore leave culture. The Navy was demobilizing rapidly, drawing down from its wartime peak of several million personnel to a much smaller peacetime force. Men who had spent 3 or 4 years at sea were going home. New men were coming in to serve in the occupation forces in Japan and Germany. The culture was shifting from the desperate freedom of wartime liberty to something more structured and strange. Occupation duty brought American sailors into intimate contact with the people of defeated Japan in a way that was completely unprecedented. The Navy established major bases in Yokosuka, just south of Tokyo, which would become the home of the 7th Fleet and one of the most significant American naval installations in history. Suddenly, sailors on liberty were walking the streets of a foreign country that had been, weeks earlier, the enemy. The early occupation period in Japan was complex and strange and often beautiful in unexpected ways. Japanese civilians were initially terrified of the American occupiers, having been told by their own government that the Americans were barbarians who would rape and murder without mercy. What they found instead, in most cases, were curious and often surprisingly respectful young men who were fascinated by Japanese culture and eager to try Japanese food and buy Japanese handicrafts to send home as souvenirs. The souvenir trade in post-war Japan was enormous. Sailors bought silk kimonos and hand-painted lacquerware and ceramic sake sets and little carved figurines. They bought cheap but beautiful items that the Japanese craftsmen produced specifically for the American market. These objects traveled home in duffel bags and footlockers and ended up on mantelpiece shelves in living rooms all across America, the physical traces of encounters between cultures in the shadow of a war. The Korean War era, from 1950 through 1953 and the long standoff that followed, brought its own distinct flavor to shore leave culture. Japan, particularly Yokosuka and the wild liberty town of Yokohama, became the primary rest and recreation destination for sailors cycling through the Korean theater. The Japanese entertainment districts that had developed during the occupation years now expanded dramatically to serve the new demand. Yokosuka's liberty districts were legendary among the sailors who passed through them. The streets near the main gate of the naval base were lined with bars, restaurants, tailor shops, and photo studios. Japanese entrepreneurs had become expert at reading the tastes and desires of American servicemen, and the entertainment economy that developed was a fascinating hybrid of American and Japanese culture. The term bar girl entered the vocabulary of the Navy during this period. Japanese women who worked in the bars and clubs near American bases occupied a complicated social position. They were simultaneously economic actors, cultural mediators, and romantic partners to thousands of American sailors. The relationships that developed between American servicemen and Japanese women during the Korean War era ranged from casual and transactional to deeply genuine and long-lasting. Many of these relationships ended in marriage and immigration to the United States, creating Japanese-American families that are today an invisible but real legacy of that era. The tailor shops near Yokosuka's main gate deserve their own chapter in the history of Navy shore leave culture. Japanese tailors had developed extraordinary skill at copying American and European garments, and they offered sailors the chance to have custom suits made in 48 hours for prices that were astonishingly low by American standards. A sailor who arrived at the main gate in dungarees could, 2 days later, walk out in a well-fitted suit with his name embroidered inside the breast pocket. These suits went home to America and were worn to church and to job interviews and to weddings, carrying the memory of Yokosuka into the most ordinary moments of post-war American life. We have to talk about the 1950s and the culture of the Cold War Navy, because this is where shore leave begins to develop the mythology that would define it for generations. The post-war Navy had stabilized into a large, professional force with a permanent global presence. Bases stretched from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, from the North Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The Liberty Port network was vast and well established. The Cold War Navy was a deeply hierarchical society, and nowhere was that hierarchy more visible than during shore leave. Officers and enlisted men did not liberty together. Officers had their clubs, their restaurants, their neighborhoods. Enlisted men had theirs. This division was so complete and so natural that most participants barely questioned it. It was simply the way things were. Enlisted shore leave culture in the 1950s was shaped by a fundamental economic reality. Sailors were not well paid. The average enlisted man in the early 1950s earned wages that placed him at the lower end of the American economic spectrum, even at a time when American economic prosperity was generally rising. This meant that shore leave was conducted on a tight budget, which in turn shaped where sailors went and what they did. Cheap bars were the social institution of the Cold War enlisted Navy. Every major Liberty port had its strip, its stretch of affordable bars and restaurants that catered specifically to enlisted men. These places were not fancy. They were not trying to be fancy. They were functional, loud, smoky, crowded, serving beer and cheap food and providing a place where men could sit and talk and argue and laugh. The social function these places served was essential. They were the community centers of a community that had no other community center. Card games were a constant feature of shore leave culture. Poker was played everywhere, in bars and back rooms and on the ships themselves whenever regulations permitted. The competitive dynamics of a good poker game mapped naturally onto the competitive dynamics of Navy life, and the best card players achieved a kind of social prestige that existed outside the formal rank structure. A petty officer who was a legendary poker player was respected in ways that his rating alone could not fully explain. Tattoos. We cannot talk about Navy shore leave culture without spending real time on tattoos, because tattooing is one of the oldest and most continuous traditions of the seafaring life. The association between sailors and tattoos goes back centuries, to the Polynesian voyagers who first brought tattooing to the attention of European sailors in the 18th century. By the 1950s, tattooing had become one of the most recognizable cultural markers of the American Navy enlisted man. The tattoo shops near naval bases were not the artistic studios that exist today. They were utilitarian operations, usually small storefronts with walls covered in flash art, pre-drawn designs from which a customer could choose. The flash was organized by theme, anchors and ships for Navy men, eagles and flags for patriotic choices, hearts and names and roses for romantic statements, dragons and tigers and hula girls for the men who had served in the Pacific. The symbolism of sailor tattoos was rich and specific. An anchor on the back of the hand indicated that a man had crossed the Atlantic. A fully rigged ship meant he had rounded Cape Horn. A shellback turtle meant he had crossed the equator in a ceremony of initiation that we will get to shortly. A golden dragon meant he had crossed the international date line. These tattoos were not decorative in the modern sense. They were records. They were credentials. They were a man's service record written in ink on his skin. Now let us travel to the Mediterranean in the late 1950s and early 1960s, because the Mediterranean was where the Sixth Fleet maintained its presence and where some of the most colorful shore-leave experiences of Cold War Navy history took place. Naples was the great liberty port of the Mediterranean. It was, in the 1950s and 60s, a city of extraordinary beauty and considerable poverty, a place where ancient grandeur and modern desperation existed side by side in a way that was both charming and challenging. American sailors loved Naples and feared it in roughly equal measure. The area around the main port, the area closest to the piers where Liberty boats dropped sailors off, was a labyrinth of narrow streets and alleys lined with restaurants and bars and shops and all manner of enterprises that catered to American servicemen. The prices were low by American standards, the food was extraordinary, and the wine flowed freely. An American sailor with even a modest amount of money in his pocket was wealthy by the standards of the Neapolitan economy of that era. Neapolitan entrepreneurs were imaginative and persistent in their pursuit of American dollars. Shoe shiners would work in teams, with one boy applying polish to a shoe while the sailor was still walking, then demanding payment. Restaurant touts would physically steer sailors through doorways into dining rooms. Souvenir sellers offered everything from genuine Italian craftsmanship to cheap imitations. Cab drivers took routes so circuitous and creative that the journey from pier to destination became an adventure in itself. The language barrier was not as much of an obstacle as you might expect, partly because enough Italian dock workers and entertainment district employees had learned functional English, and partly because American sailors were remarkably creative in communicating across language lines. Hand gestures, pantomime, repeated words at increasing volume, and simple goodwill got most transactions accomplished. Barcelona was another jewel of the Mediterranean Liberty Circuit. The Ramblas, the famous pedestrian boulevard running from the city center down to the waterfront, was a favorite strolling ground for American sailors on liberty. The tapas bars and the wine shops and the flamenco clubs drew sailors deep into Spanish culture in ways that a tourist might never experience, because a sailor on liberty has a kind of reckless openness to experience that a cautious tourist does not. Spain in the 1950s was still under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, and the political atmosphere was different from what sailors would have experienced in France or Italy. But the Spanish people, particularly in the port cities of Barcelona and Rota and Palma de Mallorca, were warm and hospitable to American servicemen, who represented both economic opportunity and a kind of connection to a wider world from which Spain had been partially isolated. Marseilles, France, was rougher and wilder than its Italian or Spanish counterparts. French port culture had its own distinctive character, and the Marseilles waterfront district was not for the faint of heart. It was where you went if you wanted to experience something raw and unfiltered about port city life. The bars were darker, the music was louder, and the encounters were more unpredictable. Let us now spend some time on a dimension of shore-leave culture that is often overlooked in historical accounts but that was absolutely central to the lived experience of American sailors across every era we are discussing. That dimension is the experience of black sailors and the complicated, painful, and sometimes transcendent racial geography of liberty ports. The United States Navy was formally desegregated by President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948. But formal desegregation and actual equality are two very different things, and the gap between them shaped the shore-leave experience of black American sailors for decades after the order was signed. In American port cities in the 1950s and into the 1960s, many of the establishments that catered to servicemen simply refused to serve black patrons, or served them only in segregated sections. This was true in southern cities like Norfolk, Virginia, and Charleston, South Carolina, which were major naval bases. It was true in parts of San Diego. It was true in many of the towns surrounding training facilities in the South. Black sailors navigated this reality with a combination of pragmatism, anger, solidarity, and creativity. They developed their own liberty geography, their own preferred bars and restaurants and neighborhoods, often in black communities near the naval bases that welcomed them with the specific warmth of shared experience. The entertainment that these communities offered was often extraordinary, because the black entertainment districts near major naval bases were part of the broader ecosystem of black American culture during its most creatively explosive decades. Norfolk's Church Street District, sometimes called the colored section by white servicemen and simply home by the black sailors who spent their liberty there, was a vibrant community of restaurants and music clubs and barbershops and social organizations. It was where jazz and rhythm and blues were performed live every night by musicians of real talent. It was where a black sailor could walk down the street without calculating the social risk of every encounter. It was, in a word that matters enormously, comfortable. The contradiction of fighting for a country that did not fully recognize your citizenship, of wearing the uniform of a democracy while being denied access to public accommodations that white sailors took for granted, was a source of rage and pain that never fully went away. Black sailors talked about this constantly, in their berthing spaces and in their liberty circles and in their letters home. The cognitive dissonance of military service in a still racist America was real, and it left marks. The civil rights movement of the 1960s began to change the landscape of shore leave for black sailors, slowly and unevenly. As public accommodation laws changed in city after city, the formal barriers began to fall. But informal exclusion and racial tension persisted, and the late 1960s would see that tension boil over in ways that shook the Navy to its institutional foundations. We need to talk about Subic Bay. If you want to understand shore leave culture in the Vietnam War era, you have to understand Subic Bay Naval Base in the Philippines, and specifically the Liberty town of Olongapo City that existed just outside its gates. Olongapo during the Vietnam War years was one of the most intense, most complex, most morally ambiguous liberty environments in the history of American military culture. Subic Bay was the primary rest and recreation destination for sailors serving in the Vietnam theater. Ships would cycle out of the war zone, pull into Subic Bay for maintenance and resupply, and the crew would be given liberty in Olongapo. For many of these men, they had been at Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin, launching airstrikes or running naval gunfire missions in support of ground operations, living with the constant reality of combat. And then suddenly they were in Olongapo. Olongapo in its Vietnam-era heyday was a city of approximately 200,000 people, a significant portion of whose economy was organized around entertaining American servicemen. The main street, Magsaysay Drive, was lined for miles with bars, clubs, restaurants, massage parlors, and shops. The bars had names like the Pussycat, the Nipa Hut, the Pink Elephant. The music was American rock and roll and soul and country performed by Filipino bands who had learned the songs from albums and performed them with startling accuracy. The beer was cheap. San Miguel was the local brew of choice, and it was cold and good and cost almost nothing by American standards. A sailor with $20 in his pocket could drink for 2 days in Olongapo, which was both the appeal and the danger of the place. The Subic Bay Shore Patrol situation was a study in controlled chaos. The area immediately outside the main gate, a footbridge over a famously polluted river called the Shit River by everyone who knew it, was where liberty began. Shore patrol posts were positioned throughout Olongapo, and the patrols worked in large teams during peak liberty hours because the potential for trouble was constant and real. The racial tensions that had been building in the Navy throughout the late 1960s exploded into violence in Olongapo in the early 1970s. The Kitty Hawk racial incidents of 1972, in which racial fights broke out aboard the carrier USS Kitty Hawk and spread into the Liberty environment, were among the most serious internal crises the Navy faced during the entire Vietnam era. The root causes were real and deeply embedded: unequal discipline, limited promotion opportunities for black sailors, and the simmering rage of men asked to fight for a country that still did not treat them equally at home. The Navy's response to the racial crisis was, to its credit, more thoughtful than purely punitive. Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, who served as Chief of Naval Operations from 1970 to 1974, implemented a series of reforms known as the Z-grams, directives that were designed to modernize Navy culture, reduce unnecessary restrictions, and address racial inequality. Zumwalt's reforms were controversial within the institutional Navy but were widely appreciated by enlisted men, particularly those who had chafed under the sometimes petty and demeaning regulations of the previous era. The 1970s brought profound change to shore leave culture across the entire Navy. The Vietnam War was winding down. The draft was ending. The United States was transitioning to an all-volunteer military force, which would change the social composition of the Navy in significant ways. And the broader cultural revolution of the late 1960s and early 70s was seeping into military life, whether the institution wanted it to or not. Zumwalt's reforms relaxed some of the most restrictive regulations around personal appearance and off-duty behavior. Longer hair was permitted, within limits. Beer was allowed in some enlisted berthing areas. The rigid social distinctions between ranks were, not eliminated, but softened slightly around the edges. And in the Liberty environment, the changes were visible in what sailors wore off-duty, how they wore their hair, and what they expected from their free time. The music of the 1970s permeated shore leave culture just as thoroughly as big band swing had permeated it in the 40s and rock and roll had in the 50s and 60s. Sailors in Liberty bars were listening to Creedence Clearwater Revival and the Rolling Stones and Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder and country music, because country had maintained its deep connection to military culture throughout every decade we are discussing. The jukebox in a Navy bar in Olongapo or Naples or Norfolk in 1974 would have had all of these genres represented, because the men who served were not a monolith. They came from everywhere and they brought their musical tastes with them. The 1970s also saw the beginning of significant demographic change in the Navy, as the all-volunteer force began to draw personnel from different social backgrounds than the draft had. College-educated officers had always existed, of course. But now the enlisted force was gradually becoming more diverse in terms of education level, with the Navy offering educational incentives and technical training programs that attracted young people who might otherwise have chosen a different path. We have to talk about the traditions and ceremonies that surrounded shore leave, because they are inseparable from the culture. The crossing the line ceremony, also called the shellback initiation, is one of the oldest and most elaborate rituals in naval tradition, marking a sailor's first crossing of the equator. The ceremony involves elaborate hazing and initiation by experienced shellbacks, sailors who have already made the crossing, and it culminates in the inductee being formally accepted into the Order of Neptune and given a shellback card that serves as lifelong proof of the crossing. The crossing the line ceremony is relevant to shore leave culture because it is one of the rituals that defines the community into which shore leave is a temporary escape. The tattoos we discussed earlier, the shellback turtle and the golden dragon and the other travel marks, are the record of these ceremonies worn permanently on the body. When a sailor walked into a bar in Yokosuka and another sailor spotted his tattoos, they could read each other's service history like a biography. That shared reading created instant community among strangers. The tattoo parlor was, in this sense, a kind of social institution as important as the bar itself. The act of getting a tattoo on Liberty was an act of commemoration and community. It said, "I was here. This is what I did. This is what I crossed. This is who I am." The tattoo artist who worked the strip outside a naval base was, whether he knew it or not, a custodian of collective memory. Let us move into the 1980s, because the Reagan defense buildup and the revitalization of American military pride after the difficult years of the Vietnam hangover changed the Navy in ways that filtered down into shore leave culture. The Navy of the 1980s was riding a wave of institutional confidence that it had not experienced in a decade. The massive defense spending increases of the Reagan years funded new ships, new weapons systems, new recruitment campaigns. The Navy recruited with the slogan, "It's not just a job, it's an adventure," and it worked. Recruitment numbers improved. The quality and quantity of candidates for both officer and enlisted positions rose. Top Gun, the 1986 film starring Tom Cruise as a hotshot naval aviator, had an effect on Navy recruitment that the institution itself acknowledged. Applications to the Naval Flight Officer program spiked noticeably after the film was released. The Navy of the mid-80s became, for a period, genuinely cool in the American cultural imagination, and this affected how sailors saw themselves and how they presented themselves during Liberty. The shore leave geography of the 1980s still centered on the traditional Liberty port networks of the Pacific and Mediterranean, but it was evolving. Subic Bay remained a major Liberty destination, though its character was changing as the Philippines itself underwent political transformation leading toward the 1986 People Power Revolution that ousted Ferdinand Marcos. The political instability in the Philippines made duty there more complicated and sometimes more dangerous, and it cast a shadow over the Olongapo liberty experience that had not been there in earlier years. In Europe, the end of the Cold War was still years away, but its approach was already being felt in the security environment. The 1980s saw a series of terrorist incidents targeting American military personnel in Europe, including the 1985 Rome and Vienna airport attacks and the 1986 Berlin discotheque bombing that killed American servicemen. These incidents changed the liberty calculus in European ports, adding a security consciousness that had not been a significant factor in earlier decades. The Navy began issuing more specific guidance about liberty behavior in potentially hostile environments. Sailors were advised not to wear their uniforms off base in certain ports. Congregating in large groups of Americans in identifiable locations was discouraged. This new security awareness did not kill shore leave culture, but it altered it, adding a layer of watchfulness that had not been there before. The chemical revolution of the 1980s also affected shore leave culture in ways that were troubling and that the Navy had to address directly. Drug use, which had been a problem since at least the early 1970s, became more serious and more widespread in some commands during this period. The availability of various drugs in Liberty ports, particularly in Southeast Asia and parts of Europe, created temptations that some sailors could not or did not resist. The Navy's response was the aggressive implementation of random urinalysis testing, which began in earnest in the early 1980s. Zero tolerance for drug use became official policy, and it was enforced. Careers were ended. Men were discharged. The message was clear and consistent: drug use would not be tolerated. The cultural shift away from drug use that resulted was significant, but it was replaced, in some ways, by an increase in alcohol consumption, which was not subject to the same testing regime. The bar culture of the traditional Liberty port absorbed some of the social energy that had previously gone into drug use, and the Navy found itself managing an alcohol problem that was sometimes as serious, in terms of human cost and disciplinary consequence, as the drug problem had been. Now we reach a moment of tectonic shift. August 1990. Saddam Hussein's Iraqi military invades Kuwait. The United States begins the military buildup that will become Operation Desert Shield and then Operation Desert Storm. And suddenly, shore leave culture has to adapt to a completely new operational environment. The Middle East presented challenges that the traditional Liberty port system was not designed to handle. Saudi Arabia, the staging ground for the massive coalition force that would ultimately liberate Kuwait, was a country with strict Islamic prohibitions on alcohol, mixed-gender socializing, and many of the activities that had defined shore leave for generations of American sailors. The Navy was asking its personnel to operate in an environment where the traditional release valves of shore leave culture simply did not exist. The solution was imperfect but pragmatic. Ships maintained their own internal recreation environments as best they could. The Navy Exchange System, which operated retail stores on naval vessels and bases, worked to ensure that sailors had access to comfort items, entertainment, and some semblance of normal consumer life even in the most austere environments. Morale, welfare, and recreation programs were expanded and intensified. The Gulf War was brief, as American wars go. But it established patterns that would become critically important when a much longer conflict began 11 years later in the same region. The 1990s brought perhaps the most significant change to the composition of the Navy in its history. The full integration of women into seagoing assignments, which had been building for years through legislative changes and policy evolution, became a defining reality of 1990s naval culture. Women had served in the Navy, as waves during World War II and in shore assignments for decades afterward. But the combat exclusion laws that had kept women off warships were repealed in 1993, and the Navy began assigning female sailors to surface combatants and then to submarines. This was a transformation of extraordinary scope and consequence, and it changed shore leave culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The obvious changes were visible in the composition of Liberty parties leaving naval vessels. A group of sailors heading into town now included women as well as men, and this changed the social dynamics of shore leave in ways that took years to fully work out. Mixed-gender Liberty groups navigated the traditional male-dominated geography of the Liberty port differently than all-male groups had. Some establishments that had defined themselves around male entertainment adapted. Others found themselves less relevant. The subtler changes were in the social dynamics aboard ship, which spilled over into the Liberty environment. The Navy had to develop new norms around professional relationships, and the Liberty environment was where the boundaries between those norms were sometimes tested and sometimes violated. The sexual harassment and assault scandals that rocked the Navy in the 1990s, most famously the tailhook scandal of 1991, in which naval aviators assaulted female officers and guests at a Las Vegas convention, forced a reckoning with the cultural attitudes toward women that had been embedded in Navy culture for generations. Tailhook was not a shore leave incident in the traditional sense, but it was a Liberty culture incident, an event that grew out of the intersection of alcohol, male bonding rituals, competitive masculine culture, and the sudden presence of women in an environment that had historically excluded them. The Navy's response to Tailhook was extensive and in some ways transformative, resulting in mandatory training programs, new disciplinary frameworks, and a long, difficult, still incomplete process of cultural change. September 11, 2001. The world changes again. And shore leave culture changes with it. The Global War on Terror, as it was officially designated, brought the Navy into a new operational tempo and a new set of geographic challenges. Operations in the Arabian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa, and the waters around Afghanistan, landlocked as that country is, required sustained naval presence in regions where the traditional Liberty port infrastructure did not exist. Bahrain, home of the Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters, became the central Liberty hub for Gulf operations. Manama, the capital of Bahrain, was relatively permissive by regional standards, with alcohol available in hotels and licensed establishments and a nightlife scene that catered to expatriates and military personnel. But it was no Yokosuka. It was no Naples. It was a different kind of place, and the Liberty experience it offered was correspondingly different. Dubai became another significant Liberty destination as the UAE developed its role as a logistics and financial hub for the region. Dubai's hospitality industry was enormous and sophisticated and, within its own complex regulatory framework, quite accommodating to international visitors including American military personnel. The bars in the major hotels were good. The restaurants were extraordinary. And Dubai offered something that the traditional Liberty port almost never offered, which was genuine luxury, the kind of experience that an enlisted sailor from a small American town might never have had access to in any other context. But the War on Terror also brought extended deployments and operational demands that strained the shore leave system in new ways. The traditional deployment cycle, in which ships would spend roughly 6 months deployed and then return home for a period of rest and training, was under pressure from operational requirements that did not respect the schedule. Extended deployments became more common. The time between returns to home port grew. The effect of this on sailors and their families was profound and well documented. Extended separation strains marriages, complicates parenting, and increases the emotional intensity of every homecoming and every departure. The Liberty port, always important as a pressure relief valve, became even more critical in this environment, because it provided at least temporary relief from the constant operational tempo. Technology was transforming shore leave culture throughout this period in ways that would have been unimaginable to a sailor of the World War II era. The Internet changed everything. In the early years of the Internet, the mid to late 1990s, sailors on Liberty began to find Internet cafes in Liberty ports around the world. For the first time in history, a sailor could communicate in real time with family members at home, not by writing a letter that would take days or weeks to arrive, but by typing words on a screen and seeing a response within minutes. The emotional impact of this was enormous. Homesickness could be addressed immediately. A parent's illness could be monitored from the other side of the world. A marriage could be sustained through daily video calls. This connected the sailor to home in ways that were genuinely wonderful, but it also changed the character of the Liberty port experience in subtle ways. If you can call your wife from a bar in Naples, the bar in Naples feels both more bearable and somehow less vivid. The radical otherness of the foreign port, which had been part of its romance and its danger and its formative power, is somewhat softened when you carry a telephone in your pocket that connects you to everything familiar. The smartphone era, roughly from 2007 onward, accelerated these changes dramatically. Sailors on Liberty now had navigation in their pockets, translation apps, access to reviews of every restaurant and bar in the port city, and instant communication with home. The mystery of the foreign Liberty port was reduced. The risk of getting genuinely lost in a foreign city was reduced. The probability of having the kind of completely unexpected, impossible to predict adventure that had characterized traditional shore leave was reduced. This is not a complaint about technology. The ability to maintain real human connection across vast distances is an enormous good, and any honest assessment of what technology has given to military families has to acknowledge that. But it is worth noting what has been lost, because the loss is real. The shore leave adventure story, the tale of the time I got completely lost in Marseilles with $20 in my pocket and ended up spending the night in a fisherman's cottage, is a genre of sailor storytelling that belongs to the pre-smartphone era. That specific kind of story is harder to accumulate now. Social media added another dimension to this transformation. Sailors on Liberty began posting photographs and updates in real time. Liberty adventures became content. The private, unrecorded, sometimes scandalous, sometimes beautiful, always personal character of shore leave was increasingly visible to the outside world, which changed the behavior of the men and women who were living it. The Navy's official social media guidance evolved over the years to address the operational security implications of personnel posting information about ship movements, port calls, and operational activities. But the cultural implications were harder to regulate. Shore leave had always been a space somewhat apart from the formal structures of military life, a gap between the uniform and the person inside it. Social media narrowed that gap. What you did on Liberty could now follow you back aboard ship in a way it never could before. We need to spend time on the homecoming, because the homecoming is where shore leave culture and home culture intersect in the most emotionally charged way possible. The homecoming from deployment is one of the most intense human experiences that American military culture produces, and it has its own traditions and its own emotional geography that are inseparable from the broader story we are telling. The pier at homecoming is a theater of raw human emotion. Families who have been waiting for 6 or 7 or 9 months gather on the pier with signs and balloons and small children in their arms. The ship comes in slowly, its deck lined with sailors in dress whites, and the distance between the ship and the pier shrinks with agonizing slowness. When the brow goes down and the first sailors begin to walk off, the sound that fills a homecoming pier is something that stays with you forever if you have ever heard it. It is the sound of relief. The first Liberty after a homecoming is different from every other Liberty experience. You are not going to a foreign port. You are going home. To your house, your apartment, your parents' living room, your own bed. The first shower in your own bathroom. The first meal cooked in your own kitchen. These are not experiences that sailors typically write about in the grand terms that shore leave adventures sometimes earn, but they are among the most profoundly felt moments of the entire deployment cycle. And then there is the period of reintegration. Every returning sailor, from the World War II veteran stepping off a troop ship in San Francisco to the modern sailor landing at a home port after a 9-month deployment, faces the task of reinserting themselves into a life that has continued in their absence. The spouse who has been managing the household alone. The children who have grown. The parents who have aged. The friends who have moved on. And behind all of this, the psychological weight of whatever the deployment has contained. Mental health is a dimension of shore leave culture that has been dramatically under-acknowledged in historical accounts but that has always been present. The psychological weight that sailors carried, from combat trauma in the World War II Pacific to the slow burn of Cold War alert duty to the kinetic, chaotic stress of operations in the Gulf, did not disappear when the Liberty call sounded. It came ashore with the sailor. It sat in the bar with him. It walked the streets of Yokosuka or Naples or San Diego at his side. Historically, the mechanisms for addressing this weight were almost entirely informal and almost entirely centered on alcohol and male solidarity. You talked to your shipmates. You drank. You processed the difficult things through the ritual of shared experience. If you could not process it, you drank more. If the drinking became a problem, you dealt with that problem quietly or you did not deal with it at all. The understanding that this approach had severe limitations took a very long time to reach institutional acknowledgement. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was not formally recognized by American psychiatry until 1980. The Navy's formal mental health support infrastructure was limited for much of the 20th century. The stigma around seeking mental health help was enormous, particularly in the competitive and performance-oriented culture of the career Navy. What this meant for shore leave culture, in practice, was that the bar district outside the naval base served functions that it was never designed to serve. It was trauma processing. It was psychological self-medication. It was the only outlet available in a culture that had not yet developed better ones. The modern Navy has made genuine progress in this area. Mental health services are more accessible, less stigmatized, and more adequately staffed than they were in previous generations. Sailor-focused programs address the specific stressors of deployment, separation, and reintegration. But the work is ongoing, and the legacy of decades of inadequate attention to the mental health dimension of military service is still being worked through. Let us talk about the traditions of homecoming ports, because every major home port has its own culture and its own relationship to the naval community it serves. Norfolk, Virginia, is the largest naval complex in the world, home to the Atlantic Fleet and tens of thousands of sailors and their families. The relationship between Norfolk and its naval community has been complicated throughout history. Norfolk was, for much of the 20th century, a classic military port town, economically dependent on the naval presence and socially organized around it, with all of the opportunities and tensions that this produces. The areas around the Norfolk Naval Base developed their own distinct character over the decades. Granby Street was the major commercial strip where sailors on liberty could find restaurants and bars and shopping. The city grew up around the naval presence, and the naval presence shaped everything from the real estate market to the school system to the local political culture. San Diego, on the other side of the country, developed a similar relationship with its enormous naval presence. The Naval Base San Diego, also known as 32nd Street Naval Station, and the Naval Air Station North Island, home of carrier aviation on the West Coast, made San Diego one of the most military-dense metropolitan areas in the United States. The city's culture reflected this. The Gaslamp Quarter, which underwent dramatic revitalization in the 1980s and 90s, became one of the premier urban entertainment districts in America, and sailors on liberty in San Diego had access to a range of experiences that previous generations would have found extraordinary. Bremerton, Washington, home of Puget Sound Naval Shipyard and significant portions of the Pacific Fleet, developed its own character, shaped by the specific geography and culture of the Pacific Northwest. The ferry rides across Puget Sound that sailors took to reach Seattle for liberty were themselves a kind of transitional ritual, a passage between the world of the ship and the world of the city that gave the liberty experience a particular character. We are moving now into the 21st century's second decade, and shore leave culture is a genuinely different thing than it was in 1945 or 1975 or even 1995. It is worth taking stock of what has changed and what has remained. What has changed? The composition of the force, now genuinely diverse in terms of gender and race and educational background. The communication technology that connects sailors to home in real time. The mental health resources available to personnel struggling with the psychological weight of service. The legal and regulatory framework around liberty behavior, which is more formalized and more consistently enforced than it was in previous eras. The security environment, which requires awareness and caution that the sailor of an earlier era did not need to maintain. What has remained? The fundamental human hunger for freedom and normalcy after prolonged confinement aboard a ship. The social bonding that occurs in the shared liberty experience. The tattoo, which has exploded in popularity in the broader culture and remains a distinctive element of naval identity. The music, which is different in genre but identical in function to every previous generation's music. The photograph taken in a Liberty port, now posted to Instagram rather than mailed in an envelope, but serving the same essential purpose. The letter home, now sent as a text message or an email, but carrying the same essential message. I am here. I am alive. Remember me. The bar near the main gate, perhaps modernized in its decor and its menu but performing the exact same social function it always has. The foreign city, slightly less mysterious now but still foreign, still capable of surprise. The meal in a restaurant speaking a language you do not fully understand. The morning after, when you walk back to the ship with sand or pavement or foreign dust on your shoes and the memory of 24 or 48 hours of being completely, beautifully, temporarily free. There is one more dimension of shore leave culture that we have not yet fully addressed, and it may be the most important of all. That dimension is story. Every sailor who has ever stood a Liberty watch, every sailor who has ever walked down the main street of Olongapo or Naples or Yokosuka or San Diego, carries stories. Some of these stories are appropriate for any audience. Some are only told among trusted shipmates. Some are never told at all, because they carry too much weight or too much shame or too much grief. The shore leave story is its own genre of American narrative. It is related to but distinct from the war story. The war story is about what happened in a combat environment, the heroism and the horror and the camaraderie of men under fire. The shore leave story is about what happened in the human environment, the laughter and the foolishness and the unexpected beauty and the genuine connection and the regrettable excess of men and women temporarily released from the iron discipline of the ship. These stories were told aboard ship the night before Liberty ended and everyone came back. They were told in berthing compartments and in mess decks and in the machinery spaces where junior sailors stood watch together. They were told with embellishment and with selective memory and with the particular creativity that storytellers apply when the audience is appreciative and the hour is late. They were told at bars, of course. Because bars are where stories are told. They were told across generations, because the petty officer who told a junior sailor about his liberty in Olongapo in 1972 was passing something forward, transmitting the culture of the institution through the medium of personal narrative. They were told, many of them, only after the teller was safely home, safely retired, safely beyond the reach of any consequence that the story might otherwise have produced. The retired chief petty officer sitting in his chair after Sunday dinner, talking to his grandchildren about the time the ship pulled into Naples in 1967 and the entire Liberty party somehow ended up at a wedding that had nothing to do with any of them, is performing a cultural transmission of enormous value. He is saying, this is who we were. This is what we did. This is what it felt like to be young and free and alive in the world, wearing the uniform of the United States Navy. The equipment and organization and doctrine of the Navy have changed enormously since 1941. The ships are different. The weapons are different. The communications systems are different. The personnel composition is different. The regulatory environment is different. And yet, reading the letters of a World War II sailor writing home from Liberty in Honolulu, and then reading the social media posts of a modern sailor on Liberty in Dubai, you find the same human being underneath the different technology. You find someone who was tired and then got to rest. Someone who was confined and then got to move freely. Someone who was far from home and then got to feel, for a few hours, something like home. You find someone who ate a good meal and drank something cold and listened to music that meant something to them. Someone who met a person they will never see again and spent a few hours in genuine human connection with that stranger. Someone who bought a small thing to take home to someone they love. Someone who stood somewhere beautiful and thought about what they were doing and why they were doing it and whether it was worth it. And then you find someone who walked back to the ship, back to the uniform, back to the discipline and the structure and the purpose of the institution they had chosen to serve. Someone who chose, every single time, to go back. That choice, repeated across 80 years and thousands of ships and millions of sailors, is the real story of Port Liberty culture. Not the bars or the tattoos or the adventures, though all of these matter. The real story is the choice to return. To put the uniform back on. To stand the next watch. To do the job. The shore was always temporary. The sea was always real. And the sailors who crossed between them, generation after generation, built something that endures. Not in the bars, which are mostly gone now. Not in the tattoo parlors, which are still there, still performing their ancient function. Not in the photographs, though the photographs survive. It endures in the understanding that human beings, even in the service of iron machines and enormous institutions, remain human. They need rest. They need beauty. They need laughter. They need contact with other human beings who are not in the chain of command. They need, sometimes desperately, to be somewhere that is not a ship. The Navy, at its best, understood this. The USO understood this. The Liberty Call understood this. The 24 hours of shore leave in a foreign port was not a distraction from the mission. It was what made the mission possible. It was the breath between the sentences, without which the whole thing loses meaning. And somewhere right now, a ship is pulling into port. The brow is going down. The Liberty Call is sounding. And a 20-year-old sailor from somewhere in America is walking down that gangway into a city she has never seen, carrying $40 in her pocket and 8 hours of freedom and the same hunger for life that every sailor who ever walked that path has carried. That story is as old as the sea. And it is nowhere near finished.